Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're still doing well. It's getting late in the semester, yes? This is week 14 now. This is our first lecture on David Hume, right? And then we'll have a second lecture on David Hume in 2 weeks, because next week is fall break. Right, we have Thanksgiving, and so the school has just given us the whole week off. So I won't be posting anything next week, as you surely can understand. Right, so David Hume, we're reading An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. This is a book about what we can know and what we can't know. We're kind of getting used to that a bit, right? That's certainly something Descartes was keen on, what can we know, what can't we know? And then Locke was also keen on the same thing. Leibniz's views were a bit extravagant in that regard. He thought we could know a lot. Hume is responding to Leibniz and the like to some extent. He doesn't mention Leibniz in what we read, but unlike Berkeley, he has read Leibniz. Hume is a more urbane, worldly guy, let's say, than Berkeley, right? So Berkeley's very connected to the church. He's very pious. He knows what he believes, and he's set to defend it from all comers, and he's not going to stray from what he considers the correct view. Berkeley's positions have skeptical implications, but I don't see Berkeley himself as very skeptical. On the other hand, I do see Hume that way. I said in the lecture on Berkeley that Hume takes the ball from Berkeley and runs with it, and I think we'll see that in the text. We'll see a very well-developed skeptical approach to empirical knowledge, right? It will be clear that Hume is an empiricist, right? So this is part of his beef with people like Leibniz, people like Malebranche, whom we have not read. But these are people who make extravagant claims, or certainly Hume would think they're extravagant, right? When Leibniz, for instance, says there's a pre-established harmony, right? So that bodies and minds are set along the same path, but they don't have to directly interact with each other. And of course, Spinoza had said something similar before that. Hume finds that extravagant. He finds that very far removed from anything we could actually know, because what we know is based on the senses and not on conceptual constructions, right? With respect to any conceptual construction, you need to trace it back to its origins or its possible origins in what we've actually directly perceived. And if you find that tracing doesn't go well, if you can't really trace it back to things that we know from the senses directly, then it's just a castle in the sky. Hume almost uses that phrase at one point in the text. He says something about a fairy castle in the sky, something like that. I'm not going to bother to look it up. But anyway, more urbane, more worldly than Berkeley, knows French pretty well, lived in France a couple of different times at least, right? So he's responding more directly to some of these continental rationalists in a way that Berkeley did not do. Berkeley seems to be steeped in the British tradition, right? Hume is in both worlds. Hume's not English, he's Scottish, so he's part of what we call the Scottish Enlightenment, which was just a period of high intellectual activity and achievement in Scotland, largely in the 1700s. Adam Smith is another person who's connected to the Scottish Enlightenment, right? We know Adam Smith as someone who came up with this idea of the invisible hand, right? He talked about the efficiency of capitalist markets, perhaps not in those contemporary terms, but that's what he was talking about in The Wealth of Nations. So let's talk a little bit about Hume's biography. I was getting excited, starting to get into philosophy, but let's say more about his biography. Then we'll get into this text that we're looking at. So Hume was born in Edinburgh, as I believe I've said. He was born into a well-connected family, right? So he had prospects because of the social connections of the family, but they didn't really have money. His father died when he was only 2, and you can imagine that was a financial drain on the family. It's not as if his mom could easily just go get a career, right, and work to support the family. So yeah, financially he was a bit strapped, but still, his mother identified him as precocious or advanced for his age when he was pretty young, and somewhere around anywhere from age 10 to age 12, somewhere around there, we don't know exactly which age it was, his mom started sending him to the University of Edinburgh with his brother. So he had an older brother. His brother was of the right age to be sent. Hume was a bit young, maybe as young as 10, but he accompanied his brother to university classes and began to study law. And that's what his family wanted him to do, right? So probably he was pretty articulate from a young age, and they thought, yeah, he's well suited for law and he'll be able to make some money, so let's put him on that track. And then, of course, like all children, speaking as a father, like all children, he rebelled against the wishes of his family. Didn't really care for law, although he did finish his degree program, which is nice. He was determined to become a scholar and a philosopher. That's a quote. He wanted to be a scholar and a philosopher. So maybe he finished his university studies around 1725 or 1726, somewhere around there. He was 14 or 15. Good for him. And then he just created his own study program in philosophy, right? And so he worked on that for about 3 years. So around 1729, he's 18 years old. He has a nervous breakdown, which, by the way, is a common story in philosophy. Same thing happened to John Stuart Mill as a young man, right? So he studies all this philosophy, gets all this learning, and gets acquainted with abstract thought, and then he has a nervous breakdown. Poor guy. And so he had a hard time for a few years. He was depressed and couldn't function very well. However, his studies, he said, opened up a new scene of thought for him, as he puts it. So in 1734, he went to study at La Flèche, which is a Jesuit institution. You might remember La Flèche. I believe I've mentioned it. That's where Descartes studied. It's a Jesuit institution. And apparently Hume had a lot of fun baiting his Jesuit professors. He would take, skeptical positions. Maybe he even played with maybe he even played with atheist positions at school. I don't know how far he took it. But he really liked baiting the Jesuits and drawing them out, getting them to put forward, pretty conventional arguments, and then Hume would attack those arguments. There's a book he wrote called The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, which is a great joy to read, if you ask a philosopher at least. He wrote it he wrote it over the course of his life, I guess I should say. Here and there, he would work on it, but as he was getting near the end of his life and he was dying of cancer, that's when he really finished the book, The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And if you were ever to read that book, and I do highly recommend it, you'll see how much fun he has poking holes in religious arguments, right? So you've got three characters in that work. One of them is conventionally pious, one of them is pretty much a skeptic, and then there's someone else who's in the middle and is sort of playing as an intermediary between the pious person and the skeptic. Near the end of the book, the pious person storms out of the room, and so then you just have the skeptic and the sort of middle guy, who's open to skeptical arguments but also trying to defend religion, and those two have an interesting discussion after the pious guy leaves. Anyway, if you're looking for something to read after this course is over, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, I recommend it. But anyway, Hume went to La Flèche, had a lot of fun. He started working on what is considered his magnum opus now, his great work, A Treatise of Human Nature. He was 23 when he went to La Flèche and started working on that book. He got going on it, wrote a lot, realized he needed to go back to England to get the book ready for the press, right? So that was his first adventure in France. He cut parts of the book that he thought would offend people. There was an elaborate discussion of miracles that ended up getting published after Hume died, along with the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. So he cut these things out, and yet the book didn't do well. Books 1 and 2 appeared anonymously in 1739. Book 3 appeared in 1740. It is a big book, so it's, it consists of 3 books, or at least they're called books. It's pretty big. It's a big read. And Hume says of A Treatise of Human Nature that it fell dead-born from the press, meaning it didn't get wide circulation. People didn't read it, but enough people read it that Hume got a reputation as a skeptic and an atheist, and he couldn't get an academic post. He couldn't get a job as a professor, which, just shows I'm going to put it from my point of view, in a way that makes sense from my point of view. The job market is random, right? You do see amazing talent not land anywhere, not land a permanent position. And then sometimes you see mediocre people stumble into a job, right? It's just random. And so this poor guy, poor Hume, he got turned down at Edinburgh I'm sure he would have loved to just go back to Edinburgh and have a position there, and he got turned down at Glasgow on the basis of a treatise of human nature and people inferring that he was an atheist, basically on the basis of that. So let's wrap this up. I guess I wanted to get into the biography because it's interesting, but now we've got to get to the philosophy. Starting in 1745, let's just say Hume was a gentleman who had the career of a gentleman, right? I mean, he was a tutor, he was a librarian, he was a secretary for a general. He just had the kinds of positions you might expect from someone who is very articulate and well connected. Let's put it that way. And these jobs weren't very demanding, and he got to write a lot. So a treatise of human nature, he never went back and worked on that original book. What he did was he rewrote portions of it to create new books. So the one that we're looking at, an Enquiry concerning human understanding, that's a rewriting of the parts of a treatise of human nature that have to do with metaphysics and epistemology primarily, right? And then there's another inquiry, the Inquiry into Human Morals. I'm not sure I'm stating the title exactly right, but it's his Inquiry into Morals, maybe Inquiry concerning Morals. That was a rewriting of a different portion of a treatise of human nature. You can tell from the title that it has to do with morality and ethics and that sort of thing. And in that book, Hume is trying to develop a notion of virtue and sort of trying to figure out what the ideal moral subject is like, especially with regard to their emotional responses. He thinks that's the key to moral behavior, having the right emotional responses to things. Okay, so yeah, he spent a lot of time rewriting the two inquiries, the one on human understanding, the one on morals. Like I said, he worked on his dialogues concerning natural religion for a long time, although there was a lot of activity as he was dying. And by the way, it's widely reported that he was in a good mood as he died, and people credit his authorship. In other words, working on that book kept him in a good mood, kept him, feeling, well, for lack of a better term, people talk about being philosophical about death. He was philosophical about his death. He understood, hey, everyone has to die. At least I'm working on something that I like as I'm going out. So I do think of Hume sometimes when I'm thinking about my own mortality, and I hope I can have as good a death as that. I don't know if that sounds morbid, but I admire the way that he died. He must have been in pain, but he was happy with his work. He's also really well known for a 6-volume history of England, in case you were wondering, okay, he's a man of letters, does he just stick to philosophy? No. He wrote a very important history of England that's still widely read. It's considered important in the history of history. I'm used to talking about the history of philosophy, but there is a history of the discipline of history, as odd as it might sound. And Hume made his mark there. Okay, well, that definitely is enough biography, right? So we'd better talk about an inquiry concerning human understanding. So let's, sorry, I'll announce the sections as I go through them, and I think that might help to orient you, right? So there's section 1 of the different species of philosophy. The main thing we want to get out of that is that there's a distinction between moral philosophy, is what he calls it, and metaphysics. The other way to talk about it is there's a distinction between practical philosophy and abstract philosophy, right? So when Hume says moral philosophy, we need to be clear on this. He means practical philosophy. This is not a book about morals, right? Nor is he talking about morals when he talks about moral philosophy. Hume sort of talks up moral philosophy. He thinks it's important, but he also makes it clear that he's going to be doing metaphysics. He's going to be doing abstract philosophy in this inquiry, right? So what does he want to say about this distinction? What do we need to get out of it? Well, moral philosophers often create compelling images. That's part of what he says. Now, he's not going to do that in this work or in his inquiry into morals, which is a philosophical work. But basically, he's saying that is a way that you can proceed in this area of moral philosophy. You can create a sort of image of virtue that excites the emotions. And you can tell that he's sympathetic to that, which is not surprising because his view is that to be a good person, you have to have the right emotional responses to things, right? So creating these images of virtue that attract us, that's a good thing. However, that's not the sort of thing that Hume is going to do in his philosophical works. And this book, as I've already said anyway, is a book of metaphysics, not a book of moral philosophy. But he's trying to say that metaphysics should keep moral philosophy in mind, and not just keep moral philosophy in mind, but keep that that kind of moral philosophy that depends on compelling images in mind. Why? Because abstract philosophy or metaphysics has a tendency to stray too far from our experience, right? So Hume's an empiricist. We knew that going into this, right? He's in that tradition. Locke, Berkeley, Hume, these are the famous empiricists from the British Isles, right? So we call them the British empiricists. So Hume's in that tradition, and he wants to do metaphysics. However, he's an empiricist, and that severely constrains the kind of metaphysics that can be done, right? So if you want to know what Hume's got against someone like Leibniz, it comes down to empiricism. And this, by the way, leads into a lot of issues in Kant, right? So Hume and Kant are very close in some ways, very, very different in other ways. But here on this issue of conceptual constructions in metaphysics versus actual experience, this distinction and this way of criticizing the metaphysical program of someone like Leibniz, this had a very powerful impact on Kant. So Kant says that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber, and it's in this area that we're in right now in section 1. That's where the awakening occurs, because Hume says, if we make conceptual constructions to explain the phenomena, Hume isn't putting it in these terms, but bear with me, please. If we make conceptual constructions to explain the phenomena, and then they can't actually be verified directly by the phenomena, then we've got a problem. And this is exactly what Leibniz did, right? And really, to some extent, Descartes, right? Descartes is also a rationalist, and so he's guilty of some of the same things. Leibniz just took it to an extreme. When you talk about monads, you're talking about something that's supposed to explain everything around you. However, you can't observe a monad, right? God can observe a monad, and supposedly monads have these properties that determine all of their behavior for all of time, but only God can see those properties. There are too many things in Leibniz's system that cannot be empirically verified, right? That's the view. So you may not agree. Maybe you're a Leibnizian, and that's fine. But in a way, Hume won, right? Because he convinced Kant that this was true, and then Kantianism really took over philosophy after Kant published his critiques. Kantianism, was very much the dominant school in the universities, and that went on for decades. Okay, so Hume really is crucial in pushing philosophy away from what Hume would think of and then what Kant would think of as metaphysical extravagance. Okay, so that's section 1. Section 2 talks about the origin of ideas. You kind of know what the ultimate conclusion here is, but let's be clear about the terminology. So we've got this distinction between impressions and ideas, and this is a key distinction for Hume, and he specifically notes that Locke should have made this distinction, and his philosophy, Locke's philosophy, was problematic because it lacked this distinction. So impressions are occurrent ideas. I think I've used this language before. When an idea is imposed on you, when it's at its most vivid and its most compelling, its most vibrant, because it's being imposed on you, when you're passive with respect to it, that's an impression. So we take it, even if we've read our Descartes and whatever, we take it that when we're passive with respect to these ideas, they're being imposed on us by something out there, outside of consciousness, and that's why they're so vivid and vibrant. So that's an impression, right? And all of our ideas come from impressions. So this is pretty much the same view that we saw in Locke and we saw in Berkeley. We've just got this new terminology. So ideas are repetition, right? When we repeat impressions in the imagination, they're not as vibrant, they're not as vivid, and we're the ones initiating, right? So it's not passively imposed on us. Then we've got an idea on our hands. And so, necessarily, all ideas come from impressions, right? And so that's what makes Hume an empiricist, is this claim that all ideas come from impressions. And on page 782, specifically, I think it might help to anchor us in the text right now. So this is the beginning of section 2. This is the first paragraph of section 2, if that helps. I just want to quote Hume here. At the bottom of that first paragraph, he says, "The most lively thought is still inferior to the dullest sensation." So he's not using his technical terminology there. But if we wanted to impose the terminology on it, the technical terminology, I think I was trying to say, we would say the most lively idea is still inferior to the dullest impression. We can always tell them apart. We can always tell whether we're imagining something or actually perceiving it. We can certainly tell the difference, right? It has to do, again, with vividness, vibrancy, intensity, things of that nature. And those are all, by the way, empirical qualities, right? And that's how we know the difference. And so that actually feeds into his notion of the real, Hume's notion of the real, right? He actually ends up saying that we recognize reality through a certain kind of feeling or sentiment, right? And he seems to be referring back to that vividness that he's already discussed. Okay. So, all our ideas come from impressions. Our minds are creative. We can form complex ideas. He says specifically ideas can be compounded, transposed. Hopefully you looked that up because you're college students. You can move the ideas around, right? They come to you in a certain order, but you can transpose them. You can move them around. Augmented, you could change their intensity or their vibrancy, or diminished, right? Again, change intensity or vibrancy or something like that. So a single atomic idea you can't generate out of nothing, right? But you can move these ideas around. You can make them more or less intense. You can make new combinations ad infinitum, right? And so that's where our creativity comes from, right? And that's how we can begin to construct knowledge, right? We could have a reason to expect that, if we combine these elements, this is the result. And so we can do an analysis in our head and do a synthesis of the atomic ideas in our head, and then do it in the real world and see if it matches our expectation, right? And so this already begins to give us an idea of how knowledge works for Hume, right? Which is the main thesis of the book. There's definitely some metaphysics here. When he uses the word metaphysics, he's actually referring to what we would call epistemology and metaphysics. But I would say the book is focused on epistemology, even though Hume isn't using that word. And then there is also definitely some metaphysics here. He's tossing out some metaphysical views. Okay, that's all we need from section 2. Section 3 is on the association of ideas. So again, there's a question about where knowledge comes from. We have to be able to construct our knowledge, and we do it through associating ideas in certain ways. So in this section, Hume tells us that the mind connects ideas through three basic principles: resemblance, contiguity. Contiguity is the same as proximity in time or place, and then cause and effect. So resemblance, proximity, maybe that's a more familiar word, let's go with that. Cause and effect. Okay. Again, this part of the text has a strong influence on Kant. Now, cause and effect is more important than the other two when it comes to the construction of knowledge. Why is cause and effect so important? Well, I guess I'll go ahead and jump into section 4 to answer that question, and we'll see if we need to go back into section 3. But we do have to understand the prominence in this discussion of cause and effect. Why is it so important? Why is it so prominent? I'm going to give you another distinction, so I'm sorry about that, but it'll help to explain the prominence of cause and effect, as I said. So in section 4, Hume says that all objects of human inquiry can be divided into relations of ideas and matters of fact. In other words, if we're trying to figure something out, that's what he means by an object of inquiry. So if we're trying to figure something out, we're either trying to figure out a relation of ideas or we're trying to figure out a matter of fact. Now, a relation of ideas is what it sounds like. Now, remember, ideas are a little abstract. They're not impressions. They're our repetitions of impressions in the imagination, right? So relations of ideas, that's the sort of thing we see in mathematics and geometry, for instance. When you say 2 + 2 is 4, it's that simple, right? Or when you state the Pythagorean theorem, right? If you have a right triangle, then a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? Those are relations of ideas. That is to say, we can just look at the ideas and ignore the original impressions, and we can say this is how they're related. And so, of course, math and geometry are the most prominent examples because that's where we're really looking at pure ideas. And symbolic logic would be along the same lines, right? When you say something like, if A then B, A, therefore B, right? That's an abstract schema, and you could put different propositions or different sentences into it and get it to work, right? But it's a completely abstract schema, and that's the sort of thing you get when you're investigating relations of ideas, right? You get abstract connections between abstract objects, basically, right? So there's knowledge there. So there is a sort of non-empirical knowledge for Hume, and again, this has a strong influence on the way Kant proceeds in his philosophy, right? So there's this sort of non-empirical knowledge, but it's not really very useful, right? I mean, going back to that distinction between moral philosophy and metaphysics, we're definitely not anywhere near moral philosophy here. That is to say, there's very little practical value when it comes to relations of ideas. Matters of fact, however, right? As you might imagine, guide our lives, and what we take to be matters of fact have a strong influence on how we behave. So we're technically in the realm of metaphysics, but we've got moral philosophy in mind, in the sense that we're prioritizing matters of fact here. We're not really going to say much about relations of ideas. So there's a sort of anti-Cartesian thrust in a way, right? Or even there's definitely an anti-Cartesian thrust, but it's broader than that. There's an anti-rationalist thrust as well, and one element of that, among others, is Spinoza and Descartes, especially among the rationalists, took geometry as a paradigm of knowledge, and they tried to make philosophy more like geometry, right? They tried to make it more precise, more conceptually clear and articulate. Right? They tried to clean up the concepts, and they thought by cleaning up the concepts and arranging the concepts in the right way, they could get knowledge. I mean, maybe that's a bit of a caricature, but I'm talking about Hume now, so I'm looking at things from Hume's point of view. That is definitely how Hume would see it. They just wanted to clean up and rearrange the concepts, and they thought they could get knowledge that way. And Hume is doing something anti-Cartesian and anti-rationalist, because he's saying, you can play around in the realm of ideas, and there's a kind of knowledge there, but it's not life-guiding knowledge, and that's not the way to do metaphysics. You can't do metaphysics by looking at relations of ideas, because relations of ideas are about ideas, right? And ideas are distinct from impressions. If you want to do metaphysics, you'd better go back to the original impressions. So let me see if I can quote something else to you here. Well, if I could find it real quick. So this is, I said I might go back to section 3. I'm actually going back to section 2, so it took me a minute. So this is paragraph 9 of section 2. In our physical textbook, it's on page 784. It's, at least in the version of the book we have, it's near the end of section 2. It's the final paragraph of section 2. It's relevant to what I'm saying now. Hume writes, "All ideas, especially abstract ones, are naturally faint and obscure. The mind has but a slender hold of them. They are apt to be confounded with other resembling ideas, and when we have often employed any term, though without a distinct meaning, we are apt to imagine it has a determinate idea annexed to it." Now let me skip a little bit and then go even closer to the end of this paragraph. "When we entertain, therefore, any suspicion that a philosophical term is employed without any meaning or idea, as is but too frequent, we need but inquire, from what impression is that supposed idea derived? And if it be impossible to assign any, this will serve to confirm our suspicion." There's a few different things going on there. So there's an insistence on empiricism that I hope you can hear. We don't want to use terms that relate to ideas that aren't grounded in impressions. Everything has to go back to experience. Otherwise, we're venturing into absurdity. So another thread here is what I said about Berkeley in my last lecture. What's meaningful? Where does meaning come from? Well, as I said about Berkeley, his view is that meaning has to come from experience. It can't come from anywhere else. We live in the world of experience, or an experienced world, if you like. So that's where meaning is derived from. This world that we actually have experience of is full of things we can actually point to and refer to, and so that's the realm of meaning, right? The realm of experience is the realm of meaning. I wouldn't quite say experience and meaning are the same thing, but that's a long discussion. But I will say, for Berkeley and then for Hume, who's very familiar with his Berkeley, the world of meaning is the world of experience. There's no true meaning outside of experience, and that's part of what I was just reading. Like, you can throw words around and make it sound good, right? And so from Hume's point of view, that's what Leibniz was doing. You can throw words around, you can throw terms around, you can build beautiful castles in the air. It has to be grounded in experience, or it doesn't really mean anything. Okay, so we have to walk it backwards a little bit. So we've made this distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact. What does this have to do with cause and effect? Well, when we're trying to figure out a matter of fact that we don't know, then we rely on cause and effect, right? So Hume fortunately gives us some good examples of this, right? So how do you know where your friend is? Pick a friend in your mind. How do you know where your friend is? Right. Well, there's some evidence that you have. If I think of my friend Joni, I know that she lives in Evergreen, right? And I know that she works in downtown Denver, and I know that she doesn't go into work on Fridays, right? So she works, I don't know, I think 10 hours a day for 4 days in a row, and then she gets Friday off. And so I can infer right now that she's in downtown Denver, right? Cause and effect is vital to all that, right? I wouldn't be able to make such an inference without relying on knowledge of cause and effect. So for instance, what if she'd quit her job, right? That would throw everything I said off, right? I'm saying she goes to downtown Denver every day to work except on Fridays. What if she quit her job? Well, we're pretty good friends, right? So she would have let me know, because friends, when they're down, reach out to their friends for support, right? That's what people are like. So being a human being causes you to be social, causes you to rely on your friends, causes you to reach out when you're having a bad time. I'm also relying on cause and effect when I think that being fired or losing your job is a bad time. I've lost jobs, right? That weighed on my psychology, gave me negative feelings, eventually made me want to reach out to people and get some support, et cetera, right? Possibly she's sick today, but then I know from past experience she likes to post on Facebook and say that she's sick, she's not feeling well, she's just doddering around the house. So I'm familiar with her psychology and how it operates, and that's all in the realm of cause and effect, right? I've come to the view that she has a certain psychology, and that kind of psychology produces these kinds of effects, right? So I hope this is making sense. I'm giving you more detail than Hume did, but I can't tell in the moment whether that's better or worse. But I can tell you, again, when you're trying to figure out a specific matter of fact, where's my friend Joni? Cause and effect relations are crucial. Where is Dr. Ogle right now? Well, the books behind me are producing an image of books that's going into the camera, and so you can tell where I am while giving this lecture. What's an example of using cause and effect to determine something that's not a location? Well, how am I going to get home, right? Maybe that's the question. There's some matter of fact about how I'm going to get home, right? Well, I could walk downstairs. I'm relying on my knowledge that my legs will convey me. That's a cause and effect relation. I'm relying on the weather report telling me that today it's not going to rain or snow, so I should be able to get on my bike and start going. I'm relying on my bike continuing to operate in the way that it always has. I'm relying on the fact that the tires were full when I walked away from my bicycle this morning, and I didn't see anything stuck in the tires, so then I think they're still full, so I think I could just unlock my bike and go. Why do I think that I can unlock my bike? Well, because I always put my bike key in my pocket, in the same pocket, so that I always know where it is, right? All these relations of cause and effect, even when there's some psychology involved, we're thinking of a person's mind as producing certain causes because it has certain properties. So it's all, everything I've stated, it's relations of cause and effect that allows us to locate something that we're not directly observing the location of, or it allows us to plan future action, right? So pretty important knowledge, right? Matters of fact are things we need to know to guide our lives, right? I've made this point already, but I'm coming back to it. Where is something, and how am I gonna get there? Really basic stuff for literally, not just figuratively, but really basic stuff for orienting your life, right? Where am I going, and how am I getting there? Matters of fact answer these questions, but then when we're not directly observing a matter of fact, when it's not a matter of impressions coming at us right now, how do we know any matter of fact? Well, we have to rely on cause and effect relations. That's how we do it. That's how we make inferences about matters of fact that aren't directly observable right now. Okay, that's a lot already. So still in section 4, but we're very close to section 5, so that's good. We cannot logically, through the use of mere concepts or mere ideas, we can't logically know how a cause will produce an effect, or that a cause will produce a certain effect. Hume analyzes cause and effect relations and finds that the cause and the effect are just two different events. We know that they're related through experience, but we don't know how they're related through experience. So it helps to bring up Leibniz here, even though Hume is not a fan at all, right? So you remember the principle of sufficient reason and the principle of non-contradiction, and how Leibniz thought these were the two main principles of knowledge. So I might have already said this about Berkeley, but that's okay. It's relevant to Hume as well. Hume certainly accepts the principle of non-contradiction. He doesn't have any problem with that. But he also certainly rejects the principle of sufficient reason, and has convinced most people that it's a bad principle. The problem with the principle of sufficient reason, which I didn't really get into when we discussed Leibniz, is that it assumes that the world makes sense. And that is what Hume is not willing to assume here. So the principle of non-contradiction at least tells us what's not the case, right? Sometimes two things are just incompatible. Two ideas are incompatible. Two states of affairs are incompatible. That's fine. But as Leibniz himself said, so it's not just Hume. This is a point where Hume and Leibniz actually agree. The opposite of a bare fact doesn't contradict the bare fact. In other words, look, here's what actually happened. I walked out the door. This works for any event, not just for human actions. Leibniz is concentrating on human actions, but with respect to any event, any matter of fact in the world, something that actually happened, right? I walked out the door. Well, it's not impossible for me to not walk out the door at the same time, right? So this general truth is important, right, in that when you're trying to determine matters of fact, you can rely on the fact that contradictions are impossible, but per Hume, you can't rely on there being a sufficient explanation. The way that Hume would think about that, although again he wouldn't put it in these terms, the way Hume would think about it is, that's just epistemology, right? In other words, when you say there has to be a sufficient reason for such and such, you're taking a human psychological need and projecting it onto the world. What's actually the case is that we need there to be an explanation. That's a psychological need that we have. Whether there is an explanation is a different matter, right? We'll find one or we won't, right? So matters of fact can be brute, right? In other words, some things are just so. It's just the way they are. And maybe there's an explanation and maybe there's not. And the only way for Hume to explain one matter of fact is with other matters of fact. And the way to relate them to each other is through cause and effect. And so, again, wrapping up section 4, you can't deduce, you can't infer conceptually, just using your rational nature. You can't infer an effect from a cause. Hume sometimes likes to talk about Adam. He's referring to the Adam of Genesis, the book of the Bible, the one who is with Eve. He likes to imagine Adam just showing up in the world. Does Adam know anything about cause an effect. And then Hume's answer to that is no, Adam doesn't. Adam can't look at a billiard ball going along the table, right, toward another billiard ball. Adam can't look at that situation and know what the second billiard ball will do when it's impacted by the first. We think we know. I mean, Hume's not gonna call that knowledge exactly, but he will allow that we have strong beliefs about what the second billiard ball is going to do when it's impacted by the first. Adam doesn't even have a strong belief. Adam doesn't have these sort of rigidly formed expectations that we do about how the world is going to behave. So your knowledge of how one billiard ball will impact another is based on your experience and not based at all on pure reason. This issue of whether bread will be nourishing, you're going to eat some bread, it's going to nourish you, that is also something you know from experience, or at least, again, you have a very strong belief. Adam, poor Adam, who just showed up in the world, he just got created. He doesn't know what bread will do, right? If you look at bread in the empiricist sort of way, you know, it's this sort of finely textured, lumpy thing with a hard exterior and a soft inside, and it tastes good, but why would I know that it's going to keep me alive, right? I know that because people have been feeding me bread from the time I was a young kid, but you can't look at the sensory properties of the bread, which is, of course, what an empiricist would invite you to do, and infer that it will be nourishing, right? So knowledge of matters of fact comes to us from experience, and then knowledge of causal relations comes to us from experience. So even though we could infer matters of fact that we're not directly aware of right now, we're still relying on experience. Okay. And then going into section 5, we're starting to understand at this point, going into section 5, that there's some kind of problem here with cause and effect. That is to say, as I mentioned, Hume has analyzed the cause and effect relation, and what he has found is that cause and effect are discrete events, right? So let's put it this way. If we look at page 789 in the physical textbook, let's see, I'll give you a section here in a second. This would be section or paragraph, sorry, we're in section 4, paragraph 16. That's what I was looking for, is the paragraph number, and this would be near the end of paragraph 16. So this is in the right-hand column on page 789, if you have the physical textbook or the PDF. Right, and otherwise just look for the end of paragraph 16 in section 4. So this is very close to section 5, at least. So Hume writes, these two propositions are far from being the same. Number 1, I'm inserting a number 1 here. I have found that such an object has always been attended with such an effect, and I foresee that other objects which are in appearance similar will be attended with similar effects. Right. I should have also inserted the number 2. I'm sorry. So let me try again. I apologize. Number 1, I have found that such an object has always been attended with such an effect. Number 2, I foresee that other objects which are in appearance similar will be attended with similar effects. There's a gap between the two statements. He's saying those two statements are different. I've always known, nourishment to follow on the ingestion of bread or the eating of bread. So I have in the past always known the nourishment of my body to follow from the eating of bread. I can say that as a matter of fact. That's just relying on memory. That's relying on actual observations. And he's saying, well, here's a different statement. I foresee that in the future, nourishment will be produced by the eating of bread. Right? A gap has opened up by the end of section 4, is what I've been saying, and then he'll try to close the gap a little bit in a skeptical way in section 5. And the gap is, I observed that cause A was related to effect B in the past. And there's a gap between that, and I expect cause A and effect B to be related in the future. Right? So the problem there is that we don't have any way of knowing that the future will resemble the past. Right? So that's where Hume's skepticism really, really kicks into overdrive. There is no rational argument that will tell us that the future must resemble the past. So there's no necessity there, right? There's nothing to fill in this gap, right? So there's no line of reason that will do it, and there's no way of making an observation that will fill the gap. Why not? Well, suppose we wanted to prove empirically that the future will resemble the past. What would we do? Well, we'd do some things, and we'd say, okay, there's our past break. Let's say we've accumulated some evidence about the past. Let's set some expectations for the future, and let's see if the future resembles the past. And then we do some more experiments, and lo and behold, the future resembled the past, and now all of that's in the past. Will the future resemble the past? Well, it did in the past. Well, will it continue to resemble the past? Well, we don't know without assuming that the future will resemble the past. In the past, the future resembled the past. Will that tell us that the future will continue to resemble the past? Well, only if we assume that the future will resemble the past. So if you're trying to prove empirically that the future will resemble the past, well, then you're going in a circle. Okay, so maybe we've established that there's only an arbitrary connection between cause and effect. There's not a rational connection. Because the connection is arbitrary, we can only know it through experience. However, experience can't tell us that cause and effect relations we've seen in the past will continue to hold. If we understand all that perfectly well, we understand what Hume is trying to tell us in section 5, and what he's trying to tell us is, despite our pretensions to rationality and reason, we only expect the effect to follow the cause on the basis of custom. He's deliberately using that word to bring us down a peg, right? Because we do think of customs as particularly arbitrary and somewhat non-rational, maybe not necessarily irrational. It depends on how attached people are to their customs, I guess. But in a way, this brings us back to Descartes' discourse on the method, where Descartes talked about traveling, right? And how people have different ideas about how things should be done, but it's all sort of habit-based, right? And they're not arguing from first principles. They're just used to doing things a certain way, and so they continue to do them that way. It's not rational. And then Descartes is trying to separate things that we can put under things we can put under rational consideration versus things that are just habit and custom. Right? This goes all the way back to Descartes. And now here we are with Hume at the tail end of the course, and we're saying, you can do all this careful work, and it is hard work, refining your knowledge of cause and effect relations. I mean, this is what scientists work on. What's really the cause here, right? We talk about how correlation doesn't equal causation. How do you separate the two? How do you find the cause or the causal nexus? Maybe it's a complex of causes. How do you ferret that out, right? It's hard work, and we're impressed with our ability to manipulate the world based on our knowledge of cause and effect. But what Hume is saying is, this isn't knowledge, right? As I already hinted, as we were heading toward this point, this isn't knowledge. This is custom. This is habit. That's what this actually is. We do not have knowledge of cause and effect if what we mean is, we have the kind of knowledge that's reliable for the future going forward. I mean, we do have knowledge of the past. That's fine. That's based in direct observation. But usually when we talk about knowledge of cause and effect relations, we're talking about our ability to manipulate the world, right? A is the cause of B. So if I want B to happen, I'm going to do A, right? So we generally take it that knowledge of cause and effect allows us to navigate the world and manipulate the world and get the world the way that we want it. And Hume is saying, well, you basically think that A will cause B because you're used to it, because you've got a mental habit. What exactly is the mental habit involved? Well, normally we say you have knowledge that A causes B. Hume is reducing that to the mental habit of expecting B when you observe A. Should I say that again? I should probably say that again, because we're really at the crux of the matter here, right? The connection between cause and effect is much thinner than you thought. What it is a psychological connection. So A and B have been in proximity. A has occurred and then B has occurred, right? And when that first happened, for you or for Adam or whoever it is, when that first happened, all that you thought was, oh, B came after A, because that's what you observed. You didn't observe any necessary connection between them. He really likes repeating that phrase, necessary connection. You didn't see the necessary connection. You observed A and then you observed B, and you didn't see the power in A that produced B, did you? Like with the bread nourishing you. You didn't really see the power in the bread that made it capable of nourishing a human being. You didn't see it. There was the eating of the bread, and then there was the being nourished, right? There was A, there was B. And when they first came on the scene, You didn't really think of them as causally related. You know, you didn't expect B on the basis of A. You couldn't have the first time around. And then it happened a few more times, and you started to expect B on the basis of observing A. And then, after it was repeated many, many, many times, now you really strongly expect B on the basis of A. But this is psychological. This is not knowledge. You can't demonstrate this. There's no rational demonstration. We're not doing geometry, right? And you don't have insight into the deep nature of reality that allows you to see in the bread what makes it nourishing. Now, I know things have changed since Hume, and we know that in the bread there are proteins and amino acids, and that our cells are running on proteins and amino acids, right? And so we're putting the kind of machinery into our body that our cells run on when we eat bread. And I know we know all that now, or we think we do, I guess I should say. But it's still the case. Hume's not wrong. He hasn't been disproved here. It's still the case that you look at the bread and you get these macro sensory properties, and you don't really know how they connect to amino acids and proteins. Right? I mean, this is all theoretical. Did you study proteins and amino acids at the university? Did you take a piece of bread and physically analyze it into its smallest components and see what it was made of? And then did you go on to study biology and look at cell structure and to see what kinds of molecules are involved in making cells work? And did you see how that interacted with the kinds of aminos and proteins that you find in bread? Did you do all of that work yourself? No, and neither did I. By the way, I don't mean to act as if I have more knowledge than you here. Okay, so where does that leave us? I mean, the main thing to get out of what we've read here, looking at sections 1 through 7, we didn't really say anything specific about 7, but I ventured into it just now, talking about necessary connection versus conjunction is the word Hume likes to use. Like two things are near each other, conjunction. There's a disconnect between constant conjunction and actual necessary connection. And so when you say the word cause, you probably think of something like necessary connection. B has to happen because A occurred. But Hume is making us really look carefully and see that we observe no necessary connection, nor can this follow on purely rational grounds. Pure reason can't tell us anything about the cause and effect relation, right? Hume works really hard to establish that. Cause and effect relations relate matters of fact with each other, and matters of fact are things you observe. So looking at the real world, then, we do not see a necessary connection between cause and effect. We get contiguity, we get conjunction. That's what we can observe. We can't observe the necessary connection. Therefore, right, our knowledge of matters of fact is much more limited than we thought. So we have pretty good knowledge of relations of ideas, but relations of ideas don't directly tell us what the world is like. If we want to know what the world is like, we have to look at matters of fact, But when it comes to matters of fact that we're not directly observing right now, right, we have to rely on the relation of cause and effect to tell us about those matters of fact that we're not directly observing. And then the relation of cause and effect isn't what we thought it was. It's not as robust as we thought. It's more psychological than anything else. We talk about cause and effect relations as if they're objective. We certainly want them to be, but Hume is saying this is actually a subjective relation. You're just used to a certain conjunction of events occurring again and again, and so you project that conjunction into the future, and then you call that knowledge. It's not knowledge. That's your psychology, right? It's you have an expectation based on your own internal wiring, right? And that may or may not match up to reality, which we can only grasp through our senses, right? And part of what Hume is telling us is your senses are limited in what they can tell you about the world, right? So this is an important contribution to science, whether it seems that way or not. All this skepticism is important and tells us a lot about how we can actually proceed in science. We can't do good science without putting a lot of constraints on it. And that's what Hume is doing. That will have a strong influence on Kant, and Kant has had a strong influence on how we think and talk about science and what we expect from science. Okay, I think it's a long lecture. Sorry. So far, you've all agreed that I should just go ahead and do the long lecture, and so obviously I've been going with that. This is a really long one. So thanks for bearing with me. I hope that this was a bit fun and interesting, and thank you.